It was early in the morning when the sun began to warm the quiet suburban street. The air was still, and the only sounds were birds singing and the distant hum of cars on the highway. On the porch of a small brick house sat an elderly man named Mr. Douglas. His hands were steady but worn from years of hard work and service. He wore a light gray jacket with a few small pins on it, symbols of his time in the military. Every morning he followed the same simple routine. He would sit in his wooden chair, sip his coffee, and polish his old medals. It was a peaceful habit, one that reminded him of the discipline and pride that had guided him through life. Sometimes neighbors would wave as they walked by, and he would wave back, smiling politely. Most days passed quietly without any trouble. That morning, however, something felt different. A new family had moved into the neighborhood just a week earlier, and they didn't know much about the people who lived there. Mr. Douglas had noticed them a few times, a young couple with a child, but they never spoke. They looked at him curiously whenever they passed, as if unsure who he was or why he sat outside every morning. While Mr. Douglas wiped one of his medals clean, a black car drove by slowly. Inside, someone glanced at him and frowned. He didn't think much of it, assuming it was just another curious neighbor. But minutes later, he noticed a police car pull up at the corner. Then another one. 2 officers stepped out, talking quietly as they looked in his direction. Mr. Douglas blinked, confused. He looked around, wondering if they were responding to something nearby. Maybe there'd been a break-in, or maybe they were checking on someone. He had no reason to think it had anything to do with him. But as they started walking straight toward his porch, a strange feeling began to grow in his chest. One officer called out, "Sir, what are you doing here?" Mr. Douglas stood up slowly, leaning on his cane. "Just sitting out front," he said calmly. "This is my home." The younger officer glanced at his partner. "Can we see some ID?" Mr. Douglas frowned. "Sure, but what's this about?" "Just need to confirm something," the officer replied, but his tone was sharp, not friendly, not respectful. Mr. Douglas reached into his pocket, pulled out his worn leather wallet, and handed them his ID. The older officer looked at it briefly, then looked up at the house. "You live here, huh?" "Yes," Mr. Douglas said. 42 years now," but the younger one shook his head. "Funny, because we got a call saying someone suspicious was hanging around this property." "Suspicious?" Mr. Douglas repeated, clearly taken aback. "You must have the wrong person." The younger officer folded his arms. "You're telling me you live here, but the caller said the homeowner is out of town." Now it clicked. Mr. Douglas realized exactly what had happened. The new neighbors didn't recognize him. They must have called the police thinking he was some stranger sitting on someone else's porch. He tried to explain. "I'm not trespassing. This is my house. You can check the records, ask anyone around here. Everyone knows me." But the officers didn't seem interested in listening. The younger one stepped closer, his hand resting on his holster. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to put your hands where I can see them." Mr. Douglas raised his hands slowly, feeling a sting of humiliation rise inside him. He wasn't used to this kind of treatment. He had worn a uniform once too, one that demanded discipline and honor. He had served this country with pride, risked his life for people he didn't even know, and now in his old age he was being treated like a criminal in front of his own home. "Officer, please," he said softly, "you're making a mistake." "Turn around." "Sir," the officer ordered. He hesitated. "For what reason?" "For your safety and ours," came the quick reply. The older officer muttered something under his breath as if unsure about what they were doing. But before he could intervene, the younger one had already pulled out the handcuffs. The cold metal wrapped around Mr. Douglas's wrists, and in that moment he felt something break inside him. His medals clattered to the porch floor, rolling near the steps. The sunlight caught the edge of one, a faded bronze star, before it stopped spinning. Neighbors peeked out from behind their windows. Some took out their phones, recording the scene, whispering to each other. Mr. Douglas didn't say another word. He just stood there, head bowed, trying to steady his breathing. One of the older neighbors, a kind woman who had lived nearby for decades, came outside. "Officers, what are you doing?" she shouted. "That's Mr. Douglas." "He lives here." But the younger officer only said, "Ma'am, please step back." Within minutes, the situation escalated. They placed him in the back seat of the police car, shut the door, and drove off. His heart felt heavy. not just from embarrassment, but from something deeper. A quiet ache that came from realizing how easily a man's dignity could be stripped away. At the station, they led him inside and sat him on a bench. The room smelled of disinfectant and stale coffee. A few officers passed by, barely glancing at him. He asked again, "Can someone please call my family?" Later, one of them said without looking up. Mr. Douglas sighed, leaning back against the wall. He thought about his late wife, about how she used to tease him for waking up so early every morning. He thought about the medals lying on the porch, maybe still on the ground. He thought about his grandson who had always looked up to him, a strong young man who followed his footsteps into the service. If only he knew what was happening right now. Hours passed slowly. No one offered him water or even a seat cushion. His wrists hurt from the cuffs, which they'd only just removed. Every now and then, someone would pass by and glance at him, probably wondering what an old man like him had done. Finally, one officer came over with a folder. "Name? Douglas. Harold Douglas." The officer scribbled it down and asked, "Address?" Mr. Douglas gave it, then added, "That's the same address you arrested me at." The officer paused. "You saying that's your house?" "Yes, it's mine. Been mine since 1983. The officer frowned and flipped through the pages. "Well, our report says you were trespassing." "That report is wrong," Mr. Douglas said, his voice calm but firm. "I'm a veteran. I fought for this country. You can check my record." The officer smirked slightly. "Sure, old man. Everyone says that." Something in those words stung worse than the handcuffs. Mr. Douglas turned away, closing his eyes. He had learned long ago that sometimes silence spoke louder than any argument. The clock ticked on the wall. The fluorescent lights buzzed above his head. Outside, daylight faded slowly into evening. He had been there for almost 6 hours with no explanation, no apology, no sign of release. Finally, another officer approached, this one older, calmer, with a trace of understanding in his eyes. "You said you're a veteran?" he asked. "Yes," Mr. Douglas said quietly. "Navy, Vietnam." The man nodded, glancing at the report. "Let me make a call." For a few minutes there was silence again. Then the officer returned. "You can make one phone call." "Make it count," Mr. Douglas nodded. His hands trembled slightly as he picked up the phone. He didn't even need to look at the numbers. He knew them by heart. The line rang twice before a familiar voice answered. "Hello?" "It's me," Mr. Douglas said softly. "I'm at the police station." There was a pause.
"What? Are you all right?"
"I'm fine. They think I did something wrong. They said I was trespassing. On your own porch?" "Yes." The voice on the other end went quiet for a second, then spoke again, calm but cold. "Don't worry, Grandpa. I'm coming right now." Mr. Douglas exhaled slowly. He felt relief wash over him, not because he expected anyone to fix things instantly, but because he knew his grandson, and he knew that when that young man arrived, the truth would come out. He sat back, staring at the clock again. The minutes ticked by slowly. The officers nearby talked among themselves, laughing, sipping coffee, unaware of what was coming. Outside, the night had fully settled in. The streetlights glowed through the glass windows, casting pale yellow light across the station walls. Mr. Douglas closed his eyes for a moment and whispered under his breath, "Let's see if they still think I'm a stranger when they meet my grandson." The air inside the police station felt heavy and tense. The hum of the fluorescent lights mixed with the sound of papers shuffling and phones ringing. Mr. Douglas sat quietly on the bench, his hands resting on his lap. He had stopped asking questions. He knew from experience that sometimes silence said more than words ever could. Every few minutes, one of the officers would glance at him. Some looked away quickly when their eyes met his. Others seemed curious, like they couldn't understand how this quiet old man could have caused any trouble. He kept thinking about the phone call he made. His grandson didn't say much, but the tone of his voice had carried weight, calm but filled with purpose. Mr. Douglas knew that when that young man made a promise, he meant it. It had been almost an hour since he hung up, and every sound outside the station made his heart jump a little. He tried to stay patient, but inside there was a small fire burning, not from anger but from disappointment. After all he had done, after the years he had given to serve his country, he couldn't believe he had to sit here like a criminal in his own hometown. A young officer walked past him holding a cup of coffee. He stopped for a moment and looked at Mr. Douglas. "You need anything?" "Water, maybe." Mr. Douglas looked up slowly and gave a small nod. "Water would be nice." "Thank you." The officer hesitated. "I'll see what I can do," he said, then walked off. When he came back, he handed him a small plastic cup filled halfway. Mr. Douglas took it carefully. "I appreciate it," he said. The young officer nodded, then whispered, "I'm sorry, sir. I think there's been a mix-up. I saw the report. It doesn't make sense." Mr. Douglas smiled faintly. "Mistakes happen. What matters is how you fix them." The officer gave a small nod but didn't answer. He walked back to his desk, leaving the old man alone again. Minutes later, the sound of the front door opening broke through the low chatter of the room. The officers at the front desk looked up as a tall man walked in. He wasn't wearing a uniform, but the way he carried himself made everyone take notice immediately. His posture was firm, his eyes steady and his steps confident, like someone who had seen enough of the world to recognize authority when he needed to show it. He walked straight to the front counter. "I'm here for my grandfather," he said firmly. The desk officer frowned slightly. "Name?" "Douglas." "Harold Douglas," the man replied. "You brought him in this afternoon." The officer flipped through a few pages, then looked up again. "And you are?" "His grandson," he said. "You can call me Elias." The tone of his voice carried calm strength, but beneath it, there was an edge, the kind of tone that made people listen. The officer hesitated, then said, "Sir, I'm not sure if—" Elias pulled a small black wallet from his pocket and opened it, revealing a badge and ID. "I'm Navy," he said quietly. "Special Operations." The officer froze for a moment, his words catching in his throat. One moment, please." He hurried into the back room, whispering something to his superior. A few heads turned. Conversation stopped. Even the officers who hadn't been paying attention before were now curious. Elias didn't move from his spot. His eyes were fixed on the hallway ahead. He wasn't here to argue or make a scene. He was here to find his grandfather and understand why a man who had given everything for his country was sitting in a police cell like a criminal. A few minutes later, a senior officer stepped out, buttoning his uniform jacket. "Mr. Douglas?" Elias turned his head slightly. "Yes, I'm Sergeant Miller," the man said cautiously. "Why don't we step into my office for a moment?" "I'm not here for a meeting," Elias replied calmly. "I'm here for my grandfather. I want to see him now." The sergeant shifted his weight. "He's in the holding area. There's been some confusion." "We're just trying to—" "Confusion?" Elias interrupted, his tone tightening. "You arrested a 78-year-old veteran sitting on his own porch. That's not confusion, that's incompetence." The sergeant's face turned red. He cleared his throat, then nodded toward the hallway. "This way." They walked through the narrow corridor, past offices filled with papers until they reached the small room where Mr. Douglas was sitting. He looked up the moment the door opened. When he saw his grandson, his tired face lit up. "You came," he said quietly. Elias stepped forward and gently put a hand on his shoulder. "Of course I did." "Are you all right?" "I'm fine," the old man said softly. "Just ready to go home?" Elias turned to the sergeant. "Then open the door." The sergeant looked uneasy. "I'll need to process his release first. It'll just take a few minutes." "No," Elias said firmly. "It'll take seconds. You've had him here for hours already." "That's long enough." The room went silent. The sergeant hesitated, then finally gave a nod to one of the younger officers. "Unlock the door." When the lock clicked open, Mr. Douglas stood up slowly, his back straight despite the exhaustion. Elias helped him out of the room and guided him toward the exit. As they walked past the desks, several officers stopped to look. Some seemed ashamed. Others looked confused, like they were only now realizing who this man was. As they reached the front desk, Elias turned around. "Before we go," he said, "I'd like to know who authorized his arrest." The room fell quiet again. The sergeant looked down at the paperwork on the counter but didn't answer. Elias leaned forward slightly. "Someone called in a false report. You didn't verify it. You didn't check records. You just handcuffed an elderly man because he looked suspicious." He didn't raise his voice, but his words cut through the room like a blade. "That man is a decorated Navy veteran. He served this country before most of you were even born, and this is how you treat him?" No one answered. The silence that followed was heavy, uncomfortable. A few of the younger officers lowered their eyes. Elias exhaled slowly. "We're leaving," he said finally. But this isn't over. Outside, the night air was cool. The parking lot was nearly empty. Mr. Douglas took a deep breath, grateful to finally be out. Elias opened the car door for him and helped him inside. They drove in silence for a while. The streetlights flashed across the windshield as the car moved through the quiet roads. Mr. Douglas stared out the window, his thoughts far away. After a few minutes, Elias spoke. "Grandpa, I don't understand. Didn't they even check who you were?" "They didn't want to listen," Mr. Douglas said softly. "Once they decided what they thought, nothing I said mattered." Elias gripped the steering wheel tightly. "That's not right. Not after everything you've done." Mr. Douglas smiled faintly. "Son, life's full of things that aren't right. You just learned to stand tall anyway." But Elias wasn't ready to let it go. "They treated you like some criminal. I can't just forget that." "You don't have to," his grandfather said. "Just don't let anger decide what you do next." Elias nodded, but the look in his eyes stayed hard. "I'll make sure they understand who they messed with." When they got home, the porch light was still on. The chair where Mr. Douglas had been sitting earlier was tipped slightly, and his medals were still lying on the ground. Elias bent down, picked them up one by one, and handed them back. "Still shining," he said softly. Mr. Douglas smiled. "They've been through worse." Elias helped him inside, then sat with him at the kitchen table. "Grandpa," he said, "tomorrow I'm going to the station again. Not as your grandson, as a serviceman. They need to answer for what they did." Mr. Douglas looked at him quietly. "You're your father's son, all right. Always ready to fight for what's right." Elias nodded. "Someone has to." Before heading to bed, Mr. Douglas stood by the window and looked out at the empty street. The night was peaceful again, but something inside him had changed. He felt grateful to be home, yet there was a shadow in his heart. A reminder that even after years of serving his country, some battles still had to be fought at home. He whispered a quiet prayer for patience, for forgiveness, and for strength, not for himself, but for his grandson who would now carry this burden forward. Down the hallway, Elias sat awake, scrolling through his phone, reading about similar incidents in towns across the country. The more he read, the angrier he became, not just for his grandfather, but for every man or woman who had been disrespected the same way. By the time the first light of dawn crept through the blinds, Elias had made up his mind. He wasn't going to let this be forgotten. Not tomorrow. Not ever. The morning light crept through the curtains, landing gently on the worn wooden floor of the small living room. Mr. Douglas sat quietly at the table, sipping tea and staring out the window. He hadn't slept much the night before. His body was tired, but his mind wouldn't stop replaying what had happened. Every sound from outside, a car door closing, a dog barking, made his heart jump a little. He didn't like how unsettled he felt in his own home. For the first time in years, the porch that used to bring him peace now felt like a reminder of humiliation. Elias came out of the guest room, already dressed, his shoulders squared, and a determined look in his eyes. "Morning, Grandpa," he said softly. Mr. Douglas nodded. "Morning, son. You're up early." "I couldn't sleep," Elias admitted. "Been thinking about what happened." His grandfather gave a tired smile. "I figured as much." Elias pulled out a chair and sat across from him. "I'm going back to the station today," he said. "They owe you an apology, a real one. And not just from one officer, but from the whole department." Mr. Douglas shook his head slowly. "Let it go, Elias. What's done is done." "I can't," Elias replied. "If I let it go, they'll do it to someone else. You shouldn't have to suffer in silence." Mr. Douglas looked at his grandson, seeing that same stubbornness that had run through their family for generations. "I admire your heart," he said quietly. "But don't let anger lead the way. The best way to fight for respect is with dignity." Elias nodded but didn't answer. He respected his grandfather deeply, but he couldn't ignore the burning feeling inside him, the need to stand up for him, for what was right. After breakfast, Elias stepped outside and stood on the porch looking around the neighborhood. The air was still cool and the street was quiet. Across the road, he saw the neighbor who had made the false call. The man was watering his lawn, avoiding eye contact. Elias wanted to walk over and say something, but he stopped himself. He knew that words said in anger never led anywhere good. Instead, he took a deep breath, got into his truck, and drove away. At the police station, the same front desk officer from the night before looked up as Elias walked in. His expression immediately turned uneasy. Morning, he said. You're back. I am, Elias said calmly. I'd like to speak to your chief. The officer hesitated.
Do you have an appointment?
I don't need one, Elias said. It's about what happened to my grandfather yesterday. The officer swallowed hard and picked up the phone. Within minutes, a middle-aged man in a dark uniform stepped out of his office. You must be Mr. Douglas's grandson, he said, trying to sound composed. Come in. Elias followed him into the office. The chief gestured toward a chair, but Elias remained standing. I won't take much of your time, he began. I just need to understand how your officers arrested a 78-year-old man without verifying anything. The chief sighed and rubbed his forehead. I've reviewed the report, he said. It was a misunderstanding. The officers were responding to a call from a concerned resident. Concerned? Elias repeated. The only thing my grandfather was doing was sitting on his porch with a cup of coffee. How's that a reason for an arrest? The chief shifted uncomfortably. I agree it was handled poorly. The officers should have spoken with him first. I assure you we're taking this seriously. Taking it seriously isn't enough, Elias said firmly. My grandfather is a decorated Navy veteran. He served this country before most of your team was even born. He deserves respect, not handcuffs. The chief nodded. You're right. I can't undo what happened, but I'll personally make sure we issue a public apology and correct the record. Elias studied him for a moment, trying to tell if he was sincere. That's a start, he said finally. But I want something else too. I want your department to meet him, to look him in the eye and acknowledge who he is. The chief hesitated, but then nodded again. We can arrange that. Elias left the office feeling slightly calmer, but deep down he still felt unsettled. It wasn't just about an apology anymore. It was about what this said, about how quickly people judged, how little effort some made to see the truth behind appearances. When he got back home, Mr. Douglas was sitting in his armchair, the TV on low volume. He looked up as Elias entered. Did you find what you were looking for? He asked. I spoke with the chief, Elias said. He promised to make things right. Mr. Douglas smiled faintly. Sometimes promises are all people can give. Let's see if he keeps it. Elias sat beside him. He also agreed to meet you in person. Said the department wants to apologize properly. The old man sighed. I don't need a ceremony. I just want to live in peace. I know, Elias said softly. But maybe it'll help others learn something too. That afternoon, word started to spread in the neighborhood about what had happened. A few neighbors came by to check on Mr. Douglas. Some brought food, others just kind words. The woman who had spoken up during his arrest came again, holding a small tray of cookies. I'm so sorry, Harold, she said, shaking her head. I still can't believe they did that to you. He smiled warmly. Thank you, but I'm fine. I've seen worse. I know you have, she said quietly, but that doesn't make it right. By evening, even local reporters began to show interest. A small news van parked down the street. Someone must have shared the story online, and now it was spreading fast. Elias wasn't thrilled about the attention, but he also knew it might be what finally made people understand. The next morning, the police chief arrived at their home with 2 officers, one of whom had been there during the arrest. The younger one looked nervous, his face pale as he stood at the bottom of the porch steps. Mr. Douglas came outside, his back straight, his cane in one hand. The chief stepped forward. Mr. Douglas, he said, I'm here on behalf of our department to apologize for the way you were treated. What happened should never have occurred. We've reviewed our procedures and will be implementing new training to prevent anything like this from happening again. The old man nodded, saying nothing. The chief continued, Your service and sacrifice mean a great deal to this country. You deserve respect, not suspicion. Then he handed Mr. Douglas a folded letter, an official statement of apology. The younger officer finally spoke up, his voice quiet. Sir, I'm sorry. I didn't check the facts. I judged too fast. I'll learn from this. For a moment, Mr. Douglas didn't reply. Then he looked at the young man and said gently, We all make mistakes. What matters is what we do after. The officer nodded slowly, his eyes lowering. As the chief and his team left, Elias stood beside his grandfather, feeling a mix of pride and relief. You handled that better than I could have, he said. Mr. Douglas smiled. Age teaches you patience, son. You'll get there. Later that day, the local news aired a short segment about the story. The footage showed Mr. Douglas standing proudly on his porch, metals glinting softly on his jacket. The reporter spoke about how the incident had led to new awareness in the community and reminded people to see beyond assumptions. Neighbors stopped by more often after that, not out of pity, but out of respect. The couple who had made the call moved away quietly a few months later. No one said much about it, but everyone remembered the lesson. That night, as the sun set and the world outside grew quiet, Elias and his grandfather sat on the porch again, just like before. The same wooden chair creaked softly beneath him. The same wind brushed past the trees. For the first time since that awful day, Mr. Douglas felt peace returning. Feels good to sit here again, he said softly. Elias smiled. You belong here, Grandpa. Always did. They sat in silence for a while, watching the stars appear one by one. The air felt calm again, as if the world had taken a deep breath and exhaled. Mr. Douglas looked at his grandson and said, You know, sometimes life tests you in ways you don't expect, but I'm glad you were here. Elias looked back at him. You've always been my hero, Grandpa. I just made sure everyone else remembered it too. The old man chuckled softly. That's all a man can ask for, and to be remembered right. And as the night deepened, the two of them sat quietly side by side, knowing that no matter what came next, they had already won something greater than any fight. They had restored dignity, not just for themselves, but for everyone who had ever been judged without being seen. The next morning, the air was filled with a calm tension. The events of the previous days had left the neighborhood buzzing quietly, though no one knew exactly what to say. Mr. Douglas moved through his small kitchen, preparing coffee as he had done countless times before. But even in the routine, his mind was elsewhere. Elias had stayed the night, making sure his grandfather was safe and that no further incidents occurred. They hadn't spoken much, simply sharing a quiet understanding that what had happened was not over yet. Though the apology had been given and the public statement aired on the news, Elias knew that true accountability would take more than words. It would take action and recognition. By mid-morning, the doorbell rang. Mr. Douglas looked through the peephole and saw the police chief standing with two officers he didn't recognize, carrying a few folders. Elias opened the door. Good morning, sir, the chief said, tipping his hat slightly. I wanted to personally come by and follow up. We need to make this right, not just with words but in action. Mr. Douglas stepped aside, gesturing for them to enter. The house was quiet but orderly. Pictures of his family and medals from his service adorned the walls. The chief's eyes lingered for a moment on the framed photographs, perhaps taking in the life of the man he had wronged. We've reviewed everything again, the chief began once they were seated. It's clear that what happened should never have occurred. We have new procedures in place to prevent this, but more than that, we want to meet with you officially. Not at the station, not for paperwork, but here where you feel safe. We want to apologize in person, with the respect you deserve. Mr. Douglas listened quietly, his hands wrapped around his coffee mug. He could feel Elias watching the chief intently. There was pride in his grandson's eyes, but also a vigilance that would not let anyone speak empty words. Elias leaned forward slightly. Sir, I need to make sure this is genuine. My grandfather deserves respect, not just a scripted apology. The chief nodded. I understand. That's why I brought a few members of our team who were involved, some of whom made decisions you felt were unjust. They will speak with you directly, and then I'll issue a formal statement acknowledging the mistake and your service. Mr. Douglas looked at the men standing quietly behind the chief. Their eyes were cast downward and their hands fidgeted nervously. He knew enough to understand the shame and unease they carried. He could have punished them with harsh words, but that wasn't who he was. Let's do this, he said softly. Let's be honest and let's learn something from it. The chief nodded again and gestured for the officers to step forward. One of the younger men cleared his throat. Mr. Douglas, I want to apologize, he began. His voice was shaky, unsure. I judged too quickly. I didn't verify anything. I didn't treat you with the respect you deserve. I'm sorry. Mr. Douglas looked at him for a long moment. Thank you, he said finally. Mistakes happen. What matters is that you learn from them. That's what I hope you take away. Another officer, older and more experienced, spoke next. Sir, I should have intervened. I saw the situation escalating and I did nothing. I regret that deeply. I'm sorry for what you endured. Mr. Douglas nodded again, appreciating the honesty. That is all anyone can ask for, he said. Then the chief spoke, voice steady. Mr. Douglas, as a veteran, your service should never have been questioned like this. We are formally recognizing your record and contribution. A statement will be placed in our files, and we will distribute it to all officers to ensure no one forgets the sacrifice you made. Elias's eyes softened slightly. He could see the relief and calm in his grandfather's expression, but he also knew that this moment was about more than the apology. It was about teaching respect, about standing up for truth. After the officers left, Elias helped his grandfather walk to the porch. The air outside was warm and calm, and the neighborhood seemed quieter than usual. Mr. Douglas looked around, seeing familiar homes, familiar trees, and the little details that made a place feel like home. You handled that well, Elias said quietly. Better than I could have. Mr. Douglas smiled faintly. Years of practice, son. You'll get there too. Elias shook his head. No, Grandpa. I still get angry when I see injustice. I can't let it go so easily. That's good, Mr. Douglas said softly. But remember, anger without control doesn't help. You have to let it guide your actions, not consume your heart. They sat on the porch for a while, enjoying the quiet. The sun climbed higher, casting gentle shadows across the yard. Neighbors occasionally walked by, some nodding politely, others waving. There was a subtle change in the air, a newfound respect that wasn't there before. Over the next few days, Mr. Douglas and Elias met with local reporters who wanted to cover the story. They spoke not about outrage, but about lessons learned, about dignity, and about seeing beyond appearances. Mr. Douglas's voice was calm and measured, while Elias emphasized accountability and awareness. Together, they painted a picture of how one incident could teach an entire community about respect and humanity. Through it all, the police department remained in contact. They wanted to make amends, and their efforts were genuine. They organized a small ceremony at the station, inviting Mr. Douglas to speak and share his experience. Officers from every shift attended, and the room was silent as he walked to the podium. Service is not just about the battlefield, he said. It is about respect, honesty, and integrity. Today I was reminded that even in our homes we must be vigilant and kind. We must see people for who they truly are, not for what they appear to be. The officers listened, heads bowed. Many of them took notes, others simply absorbed the words, realizing that respect was not given automatically. It had to be earned and upheld in every interaction. After the ceremony, Elias approached his grandfather. You did great, he said. You turned a terrible situation into something powerful. Mr. Douglas patted his grandson's shoulder. We did it together. Never forget, son. Change comes slowly, but it comes when people stand up. That evening, back at home, they sat together once more on the porch. The metals glinted softly in the fading sunlight, reminders of a life spent serving others. Mr. Douglas looked at Elias, pride shining in his eyes. You know, sometimes it takes someone young and strong to remind the world that respect isn't optional. Elias smiled, feeling the weight of the past days settle. And sometimes it takes someone wise to teach patience and grace, and he said. As darkness fell, the neighborhood settled into quiet once more. For the first time since the ordeal began, Mr. Douglas felt fully at peace in his own home. His dignity had been restored and his story had been told. Yet both he and Elias knew that the incident would leave a lasting impression, not just for them, but for everyone who had witnessed it. It was a reminder that courage isn't always about strength in battle, but about standing up for truth, demanding respect, and treating others with humanity no matter the circumstances. By the time the stars appeared in the night sky, they sat together in silence, knowing that the battle they had faced was not just about one day, one arrest, or one misunderstanding. It was about shaping a community, about teaching the next generation, and about honoring the sacrifices of those who came before. And for the first time in many days, Mr. Douglas leaned back, breathed deeply, and allowed himself to feel safe again, knowing that with his grandson by his side, he would never have to face such injustice alone. The night was quiet, the air cool and calm, and the wooden porch beneath them seemed stronger than ever. Elias glanced at his grandfather and whispered, "We made it right, Grandpa." Mr. Douglas smiled faintly, the lines on his face softening. "We did," he said, "and we'll keep making it right one step at a time." The following morning, the sun rose gently over the neighborhood, casting warm light across the streets and houses. Mr. Douglas woke early, as he always did, and moved slowly through the kitchen. There was a calmness in the air now that hadn't been there for days. The events of the past week had left their mark, but they had also brought something stronger: respect, understanding, and a sense of closure that had been missing. Elias, who had stayed over again, was already up, sitting at the kitchen table and reviewing notes he had made about what had happened. His phone buzzed occasionally with updates from local reporters and neighbors who wanted to talk about the story. Elias didn't like the attention, but he also knew it could help others understand the lesson behind what had happened. "Grandpa," he said softly, "we should go outside for a bit. I want to see how things look from the porch." Mr. Douglas nodded and took his cane. The two of them stepped out, letting the warm morning air wash over them. The street was calm, but there was a quiet energy in the neighborhood. People walking to their cars, children riding bikes, neighbors waving as they passed. Some of the same people who had whispered or watched curiously during the arrest now looked at them with smiles, a small acknowledgement of the respect they now held. Mr. Douglas sat in his chair, adjusting it so he was comfortable, while Elias leaned against the railing. "It feels different today," Mr. Douglas said, his voice soft. "Like people finally see you as who you are, not what they think you might be." Elias nodded. "That's what I wanted. Not just for you, but for everyone who might be judged too quickly. People need to remember that appearances don't tell the whole story." For a while they sat in silence, listening to the quiet sounds of the neighborhood. Then a knock came at the door. Mr. Douglas looked over and saw the local police chief standing there, flanked by a few officers. Elias immediately stepped forward. "Good morning, sir," Elias said. "Good morning," the chief replied, holding a folder in his hands. "I wanted to stop by to follow up. After everything, we realized that a more formal apology and acknowledgement were needed, something that truly honored your service." Mr. Douglas smiled faintly. "I appreciate that. You've all learned something, I hope." The chief nodded. "We have. And we'd like to do something more than just words. We've prepared a formal certificate recognizing your service, along with letters of apology from the officers involved. We'd like you to accept them here, where you are most comfortable." Mr. Douglas accepted the folder carefully, opening it to reveal a beautifully framed certificate and handwritten letters. Each letter contained sincere words of regret and acknowledgement of his sacrifice. His eyes softened as he read them. Elias watched quietly, feeling a sense of pride. His grandfather had endured so much in life, yet he had never demanded recognition. The respect he now received was not because he asked for it, but because it was deserved. "Grandpa," Elias said, "people are starting to understand what it really means to honor someone who served their country. You've helped them see it." Mr. Douglas looked up, his expression calm but firm. "Sometimes it takes a moment like this for people to notice, but what matters most is how you carry yourself afterward. Respect isn't about letters or certificates. It's about how you live and how you treat others." The chief nodded, taking a step back. "We understand, sir, and we're grateful for your patience and grace through all of this." As the police officers left, a few neighbors approached, bringing small gifts, flowers, cookies, even a handwritten note from the family who had moved in recently. Their expressions were filled with remorse and hope, as if trying to make amends silently. One of the neighbors, the elderly woman who had first spoken up during the arrest, approached Mr. Douglas. "I am so sorry," she said quietly. "I should have said something sooner. I can't imagine what that was like." Mr. Douglas looked at her and smiled. "Thank you. But it's done now. What matters is what you do moving forward." The small acts of kindness warmed his heart, showing that even mistakes could be turned into lessons. He realized that even though the incident had been painful, it had also brought the community closer together, forcing people to confront assumptions and to see the humanity in one another. Elias stayed close by, watching his grandfather with admiration. "You know, Grandpa, this isn't just about today. People are going to remember this story. They're going to think about what respect really means." Mr. Douglas nodded, a small smile appearing on his face. "I hope so. And maybe it will remind others that life is too short to judge people too quickly. Everyone deserves to be seen for who they truly are." As the day went on, More neighbors stopped by, expressing their support and respect. Some shared stories of their own families, of elders they wished had been honored while alive. Others simply listened, learning from the experience of someone who had lived through both battlefields abroad and injustice at home. By late afternoon, Elias and his grandfather returned to the porch, sitting side by side once more. The wooden chair creaked under Mr. Douglas, but it felt familiar and steady. He looked out over the street, feeling a sense of calm he hadn't felt since the arrest. "You know, son," he said quietly, "life has a way of testing people, sometimes when you least expect it. But the way you respond to those tests, that's what defines you." Elias nodded. "I've learned a lot these past few days, Grandpa. Not just about standing up for what's right, but about patience, dignity, and understanding." The old man chuckled softly. "Exactly. Strength isn't just about muscles or courage in battle. It's about the strength of your heart and the patience of your mind." They watched as children rode their bikes down the street, neighbors waved to each other, and life continued around them. Even in quiet moments, the weight of recent events lingered, but it was tempered now with lessons learned and respect earned. That evening, the local news aired a longer segment about the story, highlighting not only the incident, but also the actions taken afterward. Mr. Douglas was shown sitting on his porch, metals glinting softly in the fading light. The reporter spoke about the importance of honoring those who had served and the responsibility everyone had to treat each other with fairness and respect. Elias watched the segment with his grandfather. "People are listening," he said softly. "They're learning something from what happened here." Mr. Douglas nodded. "I hope so, son. That's the best outcome of all, that the lesson reaches beyond our little street." In the days that followed, Mr. Douglas returned to his normal routine, sitting on the porch sipping coffee and polishing his medals. But the atmosphere had changed. The neighborhood now treated him with a quiet respect, and even the new neighbors seemed more thoughtful in their actions. Elias stayed close, often accompanying his grandfather outside, making sure the peace remained and that no further misunderstandings occurred. They spent long hours talking about life, service, and what it truly meant to stand up for others. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Elias turned to his grandfather. "Grandpa, I'm proud of you, not just for what you did in the military, but for the way you handled everything here. You taught me a lesson I'll never forget." Mr. Douglas smiled, the lines on his face softening. "And you taught me something too. You reminded me that standing up for someone, even when it's uncomfortable or risky, is always worth it." They sat in silence, watching the stars begin to appear, feeling a quiet strength between them. The ordeal had been difficult, but it had also been transformative. It had reminded them both that respect, dignity, and courage were not just words, they were actions, visible in how people treated one another. As the night grew deeper, Mr. Douglas leaned back in his chair, taking a deep breath. "Life isn't always fair," he said softly, "but we have the power to do what's right. And that's what counts in the end." Elias put a hand on his grandfather's shoulder. "We'll keep doing what's right together," he said firmly. The porch light glowed warmly over them, illuminating the medals on the old man's jacket. For the first time since the arrest, Mr. Douglas felt completely at peace. He had been seen, acknowledged, and honored, not just for his past service, but for the dignity he had maintained in the face of injustice. The neighborhood was quiet now, the hum of distant traffic faint in the background. Life had returned to its normal rhythm, but the lessons lingered. For Mr. Douglas, for Elias, and for everyone who had witnessed the story, the events had left an indelible mark, a reminder that courage and respect were timeless, and that standing up for what was right could change lives. As they sat together, the stars shining above, the two generations of Douglas men knew that they had faced a battle of a different kind, and they had won it. Not with anger or force, but with patience, dignity, and unwavering courage. And in that quiet moment, sitting on a familiar porch in a quiet neighborhood, they both understood something deeply. That true strength was not only in service or skill, but in honor, respect, and the courage to stand for what is right, no matter the odds.